And welcome to Michael Tugias on behalf of the Community Senior Center and the Richmond Historical Society, who are co-sponsoring this. And a big thank you to the Vermont Humanities Council because they gave us a grant to help pay for tonight's program. So I think you've probably all read about Michael and his in the Times Inc. or in our newsletter. And so I'm not even going to introduce him. I'm just going to turn it over to him and let him take it away.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to George for the tech help. I've written 30 books, and this was probably one of the toughest, the Above and Beyond, which is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in particular, the U-2 pilots that flew. And one of the reasons it was so tough is usually with a book, you're trying to find as much research material as possible because it's so difficult to find it. In this case, there was so much material, you were overwhelmed by it. So it's finding what's the most dramatic to leave in. And as you'll hear when I do the presentation, a great research source was actually the voice of John F. Kennedy, because he secretly audio recorded the entire series of meetings he had on the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you get this inside look at what was happening. So a little bit about my writing career. The early days were a book about the outdoors. In fact, I wrote one about Vermont. It's called There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. I've had a cabin in northern Vermont for 43 years. And then I segued into history, wrote 2 books on King Philip's Indian War, and then I got into 6 books about survival and rescue at sea, and was very fortunate. One became a Disney movie called The Finest Hours, and that was just a really lucky break for that to happen. But we were talking earlier, Jane and I have a book coming out in 2 months. It's called The Waters Between Us. And it's another book about Vermont and Massachusetts. It's a memoir about growing up and the relationship with my father, and something that he did that was extraordinary later in life when our family was hit by tragedy. But most of the book is lighthearted, and it's about outdoor misadventures. And one of the outdoor misadventures happened right in your backyard. We were talking about the Winooski River raft race that the last one was held in 1976 that I had planned to participate in. And in the book, I write that a week before the raft race, I thought I'd give my little raft a workout. And the place I picked for the workout was the Huntington River in late April. Not a smart move at all. And in the book, I've written all these books about survival. That's my only life and death survival story, was that trip on the Huntington River and being thrown out of the raft and being caught in a whirlpool. And then the week after, they had the Winooski River raft race, and it was the same scenario, only on a larger scale, with many people in trouble. And there was a gentleman and I who's watching tonight, and he was one of the first responders. And our memories are in sync of just how scary that event was. So I write about those in The Waters Between Us, because about half the book takes place in Vermont. But I'm going to share my screen now because there's some amazing slides from this Cuban Missile Crisis, and there'll be 4 incidents that I'll really kind of home in on that few people know about. You might have heard of one, maybe 2, but few people know about all 4. I certainly didn't. So if I can remember, I go to Present Now and share my screen. And let's see what happens. Here we go. It says I'm presenting. I don't see my screen here. What did I do wrong? I'll minimize this screen. There we go. Can you see it now? Okay, good. The book is titled Above and Beyond because we're taking a view of the Cuban Missile Crisis largely through the eyes of the U-2 spy plane pilots that put their lives on the line. And this is what a U-2 spy plane looks like. The primary feature that makes it so unique is that it can fly 13 miles above the Earth, so that Soviet MiGs, fighter jets, could not reach it. But as you remember with the story of Gary Powers, who was shot down over Russia, a Soviet surface-to-air missile could hit it and did. The fact that he survived is 1 in a million. In fact, Eisenhower was told, if they ever shoot down one of our U-2s, no one could ever survive. And then, boy, was he in for a shock when the Russians paraded Gary Powers.
Excuse me. Is there a way to get the photos that you have on screen?
Oh, are you not able to see them?
I can't.
How about everybody else? Can everyone else see the photos?
We can see them.
Yes, I can see them.
Yes.
So everybody else,
I can see them. Yes,
Yeah.
I can see them.
everybody can see them except you, so I'm not sure what you might be doing different.
I don't know. Can George help us out?
But it's only your computer. It's not everybody else's is fine. So I don't.
Can't see them.
Two people cannot see the photos
I don't know what that would do, quite frankly.
because everybody else says they can see them.
We see your face and the top, the parts of your chair.
Yep. So they're only seeing me, George, is those two people. That the rest can all see the photos.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes. Right there. Ah, now we see it. Thank you.
Okay, that's good news. The big risk for the pilots flying the U-2 is that if it loses air pressure, you'll be dead within 30 seconds. So they would wear these pressure suits that you see here. And this gentleman, by the way, is Steve Heiser. He's the one that discovered the nuclear missiles. So the pressure suit would save your life if you lose cabin air pressure. And it was interesting in my research, I found that these pressure suits were built in a bra factory in Worcester, Massachusetts. And the pilots told me they were brought there in total secrecy, brought down into the basement. They'd go into this tiny little room with just one light bulb, and the tailor would take their measurements. And then the next day they'd come back and the whole pressure suit would be ready to go. So it was at the Clark factory in Worcester, Mass, who still makes them today. And every year the military says we're going to retire our U-2s, but they always extend it another year. So the stakes couldn't be higher because I learned that both the US and the Russians had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons of all shapes and sizes. Now, a little bit of the background leading up to the crisis, you have Castro taking power in 1959. Then you have our failed Bay of Pigs expedition that was hatched under the Eisenhower administration, but launched under the Kennedy administration. And later, I'll probably mention how this whole Bay of Pigs, even though it failed, might have been a blessing because Kennedy learned so much from his mistakes during that incident, and that he applied those lessons to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then the Soviets began their military buildup in 1962, which we were well aware of, but we did not have intelligence that they had offensive weapons there or nuclear missiles there until October 14th, when a U-2 was authorized to fly over Havana and San Cristobal. So Khrushchev, when I came into this research, I thought he'd turn out to be this mercurial, kind of half-crazed man, but not at all. He was a shrewd operator, fought in World War II. I was very lucky that his son, who at the time was old enough to have discussions with his father during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his son now lives in the US. So I interviewed him for the book. And in Above and Beyond, there's some quotes from his son that he said, "This is what my father was telling me." And, Kennedy, when he learned about the missiles, he said, "It's not just a military threat to us, it's a political threat." He said, "If I don't get them out of Cuba, I'll be impeached." And I do believe he was correct on that. I don't think the American people were ready for it. So they were medium-range ballistic missiles by and large. And I'm writing the book for the general public, not for the military experts, so I'm learning as I go along. I never realized how large Cuba really is. Its length is over 700 miles long. I didn't even know where the Bay of Pigs was in relationship to Havana. And next I'm going to introduce you to the four main characters. The first is Major Jerry McElmoyle, and Jerry was the rookie U-2 pilot. So when we learned the Soviets had nuclear weapons in Cuba, we brought our 10 best pilots to Florida to make a number of surveillance missions, and Jerry was involved in that. Jerry's boss was Rudy Anderson, that you see in this picture, a really interesting character. He fought in the Korean War, but yet he really was a pacifist. He did not want to drop bombs and kill people, so he would always volunteer for reconnaissance missions, and he was a very good pilot. So later, of course, this is after the Korean War, the CIA recruited him into the U-2 spy plane program. And you had to be an exceptional pilot because the U-2s were very temperamental aircraft. No two flew exactly the same. I like to describe the aircraft as a glider on steroids because it was so lightweight, but yet it had a jet engine. And then another one of the pilots was Chuck Maltzby. Chuck also fought in the Korean War. He was a fighter pilot as well, shot down by the Chinese. And he was kept as a POW. He said it was in an earthen cave, 4 feet by 5 feet for 3 years, if you could imagine what that conditions must have been like. Yet when he was released in a POW exchange, he re-upped in the Air Force. I was shocked. I would have never flown a plane again. And he was recruited into the U-2 spy plane program because he was an exceptional pilot. In fact, he flew some of those Thunderbird aircrafts with all the maneuvers. And then JFK, you would expect him to be a character in the book. But again, I didn't know to what depth he would appear. And then when I realized he secretly audio recorded all his meetings, I said, oh my God, this is like having an inside seat to the cabinet room of what was happening. And how he conducted his meetings was very interesting as well. He did not surround himself with yes men. He had a cross section of people in there, some who disagreed vehemently with JFK, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So the crisis begins when Steve Heiser comes back with those photos. You know, these are old-fashioned films. The film in a U-2 could stretch for, half a mile, and that had to be flown by jet to Washington, D.C., a secret location to be developed and analyzed. And then Kennedy was told while he was having breakfast. And I wondered what would his first question be, because I do a program for business groups called 14 Steps to Strategic Decision Making, about JFK and the crisis. And I figured he'd say, well, how many missiles? Where are they? But he had two questions. First, he wanted to make sure there were missiles in these photos because he said, I can't see them. And he was told, Mr. President, back at the lab, we've been enhancing these and we've brought in every single expert, and we have 100% agreement that what we're looking at is a medium-range ballistic missile. But his second question is really telling for any series of decisions you have to make to arrive at the final conclusion, and that was, how much time do I have? He wanted to know, when will the missiles be operational? In other words, when will the nuclear warheads be on the missiles? And the best estimate that they gave him was between 10 and 14 days, and that turned out to be very accurate. The nuclear warheads were in Cuba at the time, and these missiles were almost ready that with the press of a button they could be launched. And the reason he wanted to know that is once they had the capacity to launch them, they'd kind of have the United States over a barrel. If we took military action or threatened to, they could say, we're just going to launch these, and they're right in your backyard. So again, that's a critical step to making any big decision. You don't want to be rushed if you don't have to be, because new information may come in, and you'll see how this plays a really big role for Kennedy's decision and how his decision evolves over time. So his second step, and this would be the same for any of us in a big decision, is get some trusted people who you can bounce your ideas off of. So he called it the ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, all sorts of people on it. What surprised me is he had like the Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm like, why would he be there? And then as I studied further, it's Kennedy wanted the best and the brightest minds. So not just the CIA and the military, he wanted some others there as well. And they didn't all have to be Democrats either. So the hidden microphones were in the bookcase, and this photo was taken during the crisis. So you see some of the players there you may recognize, LBJ in the center, kind of with his face looking down back towards us, Bobby Kennedy standing up on the left, McNamara's there, and the president is leaning over the desk. And one of the first things the president decides is to do more U-2 overflights over Cuba because we were getting ready for a military invasion. On the first 2 days of his meetings, most people there, and there's people kind of coming and going. Sometimes they'll bring in someone for just 2 meetings rather than for every meeting. And they're all coming to the same conclusion that we're going to do airstrikes on Cuba and take out the missiles, take out their surface-to-air missiles as well, and probably follow it up with a D-Day style invasion. So they want as much intel as they can get, and the next pilot to go is Rudy Anderson. And when Rudy comes back, his film shows that it's not just a couple nuclear missiles in San Cristobal outside of Havana. They're in other locations as well. So right under our noses, the Russians were able to pull this off, bringing the missiles, getting the launch pads ready, and they were almost in operational condition. The U-2s, they don't carry any weapons at all. So if you're flying over Cuba, you're putting your life at risk because you're a sitting duck if the Soviets decide to fire surface-to-air missiles at you. And it really was an amazing aircraft and put together in a short period of time, 3 years kind of from the idea to getting those test flights. And one thing they realized during the test flights is the wings are so long that while the aircraft is taking off, they'd sometimes scrape on the ground. So the solution, like so many solutions, was simple. Let's just put these little pogo sticks with wheels underneath the wings, and as soon as the aircraft elevates, these will fall away. So it prevents drag. And then when it lands, there's less fuel in the aircraft, so the wings don't scrape the ground. So they brought the best U-2 pilots and our best U-2 aircraft to Orlando, which there was no Disney World, so that was McCoy Airfield, and that was to get them close to Cuba. The pilot I worked with, Jerry McElmoyle, said it only took 40 minutes from Orlando to reach Havana. And the one drawback to the U-2's photography was it could not pierce cloud cover, so it wasn't like radar. You had to have a clear day. So whenever the days were relatively clear, they'd launch U-2s in sequence. There'd never be two going over Cuba at the same time that I'm aware of, but they'd launch one after another. As soon as one was out of Cuban airspace, another one would come. Because you're violating another country's airspace, but they had to do it. Now, 3 days into the crisis, Kennedy, who's in his favorite rocking chair, by the way, his back was causing him constant pain. In the book, we write a little bit about how, he was a war hero himself with PT-109, saved lives, but he did suffer a back injury and would actually travel around with a bag of painkillers. And how he stayed lucid, I don't know if you're taking painkillers, but in all these meetings, he's always in charge, he's always in control. He's usually the most thoughtful one in the room. But there's a funny story behind this photo. He's giving a meeting to the Soviet foreign minister and the Soviet ambassador. And at that meeting, the topic of Cuba comes up, and they say, Mr. President, you're aware of our military buildup, but we can assure you there's no nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, Kennedy knows about the nuclear missiles by this time, but he doesn't want to tip his hand because he hasn't quite decided what he's going to do. And as soon as they leave the room, he turns to Bobby. He goes, I can't believe they lied to me right in the Oval Office. It was all I could do not to walk to my desk, pull the drawer open, and shove the photos right under their nose. But again, he had to play it close to the vest because he's weighing his options. And what happened is, by day 3 or 4 of the crisis, he's moving away from the full-scale military strike that most people in the ExComm committee still believe is the best response. Particularly Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the Air Force and the head of Strategic Air Command, those bombers that carry the nuclear arsenal. And LeMay and the president are getting in some heated arguments. In the book, I say it's borderline insubordination, some of the things that LeMay said. I remember one exchange. LeMay goes, what you're doing is worse than the appeasement of Munich. And another time he goes, you're in a bad fix. And Kennedy goes, what did you just say? And LeMay goes, I said you're in a bad fix. And Kennedy goes, well, you're in it with me. So Kennedy's trying to diffuse the tension in the room, and yet he doesn't exclude LeMay from some of the meetings, even though he's borderline insubordinate, because he doesn't want to be surrounded by yes men. He wants to hear people like LeMay who say, we should attack now while we have the element of surprise. And Kennedy would push back and go, well, don't you think that may lead to millions of innocent people being killed if this leads to nuclear war? And LeMay would go, absolutely not. The Soviets won't do a thing. And Kennedy goes, at the very least, I think they're going to take West Berlin. So Kennedy decides on the blockade and some people say, hey, that won't work. And Kennedy goes, it may not, but that allows me more steps rather than going to all out war. He does tell LeMay, kind of throwing him a bone, he says, if they shoot down one of our U-2s, I promise you, you're going to be able to go in with your fighter aircraft and just wipe out that surface-to-air missile site that did it. And then Kennedy goes on national TV. His big concern, though, is that there may be some kind of misunderstanding that things get out of control. And Premier Khrushchev's son, Sergei, said to me, that was my father's main concern as well. He phrased it differently. He said, my father's concern was someone on the ground in Cuba would have a different agenda than my dad, and my dad would lose control. So, because we're at DEFCON 2, one step away from all-out war, constantly having bombers in the air with nuclear weapons. So Kennedy tells the nation about the missiles and what our response is. And if you're interested, you can pull this up on YouTube and see that he handles it very well. And I should mention too, for videos, on my website, there is a video of one of the U-2 pilots describing his, well, I'll leave you in suspense. I'll tell you about it in a moment or two, but his close encounter. And, you know, the reason people were so anxious is the next day the Russians said, your blockade is illegal. It's a step towards nuclear war. And there's one story I'll always remember. I was doing this program before COVID, so it was in person, and a woman in the audience said, I was just a young girl. And she said, I went to school the next day, and at the end of the day, the teacher goes, there'll be no homework because there may not be a tomorrow. And I was like, wow, what a thing to say. But she said that gives you an idea of how anxious people were about what was happening. And another woman said right after Kennedy's speech ended, her dad went out in the backyard and just started digging the bomb shelter. So now, as you get into, you know, the later stages, the whole 13-day crisis, there's so much involved. I'm just trying to give you the overview and pick and choose a few things to tell you about. But we start to launch Crusader aircraft going over Cuba to get even better photos, because these aircraft were different than the U-2s. They could go 500 miles per hour right at treetop level and still get pictures. This photo here was taken by a Navy Crusader. And you could see, I don't know how they did it back in 1962 to have such clarity, but that big tent in the middle, that's housing a nuclear missile there. And we knew by the length, we knew exactly that medium range ballistic missiles were 67 feet. So we knew where they were under some of these camouflage tents. We also knew that there were surface-to-air missiles. They're not in this screen to protect them. And we were well aware that the Soviet radar could track our U-2 flights. So while their fighter jets couldn't go up and bring one down, they knew where they were and they had the surface-to-air missile capability. But Khrushchev had told the leaders on the ground, you're not allowed to fire the surface-to-air missiles until I give the okay, and you're not allowed to fire any nuclear weapons unless World War III has broken out. So at the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson tells the world what we, the US, have found and why we're doing this blockade. I think we use the words quarantine to make it sound as if it was legal, but it's still at the time, it's kind of an illegal maneuver on the high seas to block another country, but we're giving our case, and we had the full backing of all the nations in the Western Hemisphere. So Kennedy was very good at building a coalition around what he was going to do. And then Stephen brought out some of the photographs to give the proof as well. It reminded me of Colin Powell bringing out what he thought was photos of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which turned out to be faulty. But here, all the intelligence we had was on target. We were just late in gathering it, and had we just been 2 weeks later, the whole outcome might have been different. So now it's Jerry's turn to fly. And again, he's the youngest pilot. He's only 33 years old. And he's got quite a story. And when I tackle a book, I like to open it with a dramatic chapter. And I opened Above and Beyond with Jerry's flight. Because in the beginning, it's routine. He's going to do the whole length of Cuba and get photographs of 4 different targets. And he's over the eastern end of Cuba, over a town called Banyas. And that's where the Soviets decide to fire at him. Now, the way Jerry explained it, he said, I was already banking the aircraft for home after I photographed around Guantanamo Bay in Banyas, when he said in the rearview mirror, I could see a contrail coming up at me. And then he said, I saw the starburst, the explosion. But he said it was probably an eighth to a quarter mile away, and the shrapnel couldn't hit him. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I did what I'm trained to do. He said, I banked the plane a little more and turned on my cameras because there was another contrail coming up in the exact same spot. And he said, I turned on the cameras, got it all on film in the second starburst. And I said, did it look like this? And he said, well, that's what it looks like when it originally explodes. But then he said that the starburst is because the shrapnel is going in all different directions after that. I said, then what? And he goes, I got the hell out of there. And he said, when he landed at McCoy, of course, the debriefing occurs with the Air Force and the CIA, and he tells them what happens. And he says, I got it all on film. And then after a long 2-hour session, they let him go, and he tells Rudy and the other pilots what happens. But the strangest part to this story is the next morning, Jerry said, he goes, I'm walking out to my aircraft, and I hear McElmoyle, and I turn around, and I see this 3-star general who I've never seen before. And he goes, yes, sir. And the general goes, McElmoyle, we've examined your film and we found nothing on it. And Jerry goes, sir, I'm positive I got the contrails and the starbursts of the surface air missiles. And the general goes, not only was there nothing on your film, we destroyed your intelligence report and the film because you were mistaken. And Jerry goes, sir, I'm sure. And finally the general goes, do you understand what I'm telling you? In other words, mum's the word, keep it quiet. We don't know who ordered that. We think we know why. They wanted to keep it from Kennedy, because if Kennedy knew, he might have stopped the U-2 overflights, not wanting another situation like Gary Powers, having one of our U-2 pilots captured and being paraded around, or just out of fear of loss of life for the U-2 pilots. But in all those Kennedy tapes of all the meetings, this is never brought up, so it never reached as high as the president. So now, in the interest of time, we jump ahead to day 13, and this is when everything kind of goes wrong. And this is when the 3 other incidents, you probably didn't know about Jerry McElmoyle's close call, but there's 3 more incidents that are even more terrifying from my perspective in terms of how close we were to nuclear war. And what a burden on the president. He was only, I believe at this time he was 45 years old. That's pretty young to have such pressure on you. And the pressure where the majority of your advisors are telling you to do something different than what you're doing, saying this blockade isn't removing the missiles at all. You need to take more action, military action right away before the Soviets can get up to speed. And a real close call comes with Soviet sub B-59. There were 4 Soviet subs that were in this Foxtrot category, and each one carried one weapon that had a nuclear warhead. They had other torpedoes, but one torpedo had a nuclear warhead. We had told the Russians, if your subs approach the quarantine line, we're going to drop practice depth charges to let them know we've located you. You need to surface right away and then move away from the blockade line. Whether that message got to the commander of B-59 or not, I don't know. But in an interview with the men on board, they said there were so many depth charges dropped that we were being rattled inside. The way they described it, they said it was like being in a steel drum and somebody taking a sledgehammer to it. And these subs, were not advanced like they are today. The heat was unbelievable. They were running low on water, so water had to be rationed. And after more and more of these depth charges are shaking the sub, the commander thinks this is World War III. These aren't practice, these are real, getting closer. So he goes to the first lieutenant, I guess you would call it, prepare the special torpedo. And they actually load the torpedo with the nuclear warhead into the firing tube. And then he tells the senior men, we're all going to die, but we're going to take them with us. And it's luck that they don't launch this torpedo, which would have led us to respond in kind, and nuclear war would have happened. The luck is the flotilla coordinator happened to be on this particular sub, and while he didn't have control over the sub, he was of an equal rank, and his name, here he is a little later in life, Sergei Arkhipov. He says, we don't know if World War III is broken out. We've had no instructions from Moscow to launch the special torpedo. You can't do it. And he's then backed up by one of the political appointees on board the sub. And they talked this commander down off the ledge. But it was that close. It was actually in the firing tube. He had prepared his crew to launch that nuclear torpedo. And that would have taken out the aircraft carrier in the area, the warships around it, would have extended for a 15, 20-mile radius. So, we give a lot of credit to President Kennedy, but Sergei Arkhipov deserves credit as well. He later actually died, I was just reading this, from an accident on a nuclear-powered Soviet sub that had developed a leak, and he later died from that exposure. The next event you've probably never heard of involved Chuck Maltzby, that pilot who was taken POW by the Chinese. He's up in Alaska, and you're probably thinking, what's that got to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, he's told, fly over the North Pole in your U-2. We've equipped it with carbon filters to take sampling of the air, the radioactivity in the air, to monitor what the Soviets are doing with their nuclear weapons. And this was kind of standard procedure over the last year. What wasn't standard was to go all the way over the North Pole from Alaska and then back again. So it's going to be a long, long flight all alone. And there is no GPS back then. So at night, you've got to use celestial navigation, and they plan for all the scenarios for this long flight. But as Chuck said, they did not plan for the aurora borealis. And so this occurs over the area near the North Pole, and he can't see the stars well enough to match them up with his chart to know exactly the proper headings. And he's so far away, he can't radio for any kind of help. He left from Eisen Air Force Base near the bottom of the screen, and then his last radio contact was over Barter Island, and then it's towards the North Pole, and that's where the northern lights come out. So he's lost, in effect, and he's trying to find his way back because the Northern Lights don't go away, they stay out. And he said, in retrospect, some things are humorous, but not at the time. He said, I knew I was in trouble when on the way back I'm fiddling with my radio trying to reach some help, and I heard Russian music. So he knows he's strayed too far to the west. The Soviets have picked him up on radar. They don't know if this is the beginning of an attack or what. They send MiGs up to get him, and normally the MiGs couldn't reach him. But Chuck looks at his instrument panel and he sees that he's almost on empty in terms of fuel. So he's got a big decision to make. I don't want to give this whole thing away because I want there to be surprises if you read the book, but he does come to the decision that I am not going to be taken POW again. And you've got Soviet MiGs coming towards him. You've got US fighter jets with nuclear missiles on them coming to his aid. And Chuck decides to turn the power in the aircraft off to conserve fuel, which means he's going to start gliding down to the level of the MiGs. But he knows if he doesn't do that, he's going to crash. He needs to reserve just a little bit of fuel for the actual landing, if and when he ever lands. So that part I won't give away because it's something like out of fiction. It's like there's so many twists and turns of what happens with Maltzby and the Russians and then our fighter jets as well. And by coincidence, at the same time, Rudy Anderson is launching from Orlando to do what's probably the last U-2 flight over Cuba before we go ahead with our attack, which would have either happened on the next day, which was Sunday, or on Monday. And Rudy actually volunteered for this flight. It was Steve Heiser's turn, but Rudy wanted it because, again, being a pacifist, he wanted to be known as one of the top reconnaissance pilots in the world. So he volunteered to take it. And he was going over Cuba, and the Russians had him on radar. And two of the Russian generals on the ground, neither one was the supreme commander, are deciding war is imminent, hours away from all our intelligence. And they go, our guest is overstayed his welcome, meeting Rudy Anderson. And so the other one goes, I agree, let's get permission to take him down. And they can't get a hold of the Supreme Commander. He was ill. He was so ill, he couldn't even take phone calls. So these guys figured, okay, we're in charge. And without the blessing of Khrushchev, they decide to take down Rudy's aircraft. And they say to the surface-to-air missile site at Banyas, Cuba, they had given Rudy's aircraft a number. It was target 33. They say, destroy target number 33. And as Rudy's going over, he's in a U.S. Air Force U-2, because Kennedy was adamant, I do not want any CIA pilots, maybe because he felt he got burned during the Bay of Pigs. But again, as I said, he learned so much from the Bay of Pigs, and one was, don't let the military make the decisions without you first asking every conceivable question there is. He felt he didn't ask enough questions, didn't have the proper information about the complete Bay of Pigs story. And Kennedy also got cold feet with the Bay of Pigs and withdrew air support for that invasion. So the whole thing was doomed to failure, both in the planning and the execution. So Rudy's up in an aircraft just like this and heading from the length of the island from Havana down towards Guantanamo Bay, which is near Banyas, when the Russians fire the weapons, the surface-to-air missiles. Now, this next part I'm speculating a little bit, but what I think happened was it was not a direct hit, but close enough. And I was very fortunate that I had Jerry McElmoyle to work with At the time, Jerry was in his late 80s, but he was sharp as a tack. Jerry later became a brigadier general. He was actually in charge of part of our nuclear arsenal under the Reagan administration. So I could call Jerry up and I said, Jerry, I finally found the picture I've been looking for of Rudy's aircraft after it was hit. Why isn't it in a million little pieces? And I'll show you the picture I found. This was taken by a Cuban. The Russians were the ones who shot it down, but the photo was taken by a Cuban. And I said, the fuselage and the cockpit are intact. Major Anderson, by the way, is dead inside. He never did eject. And Jerry said, I think the aircraft was wounded, Mike, and if it's wounded, the way he explained it, he said, it's like a leaf falling from a tree. It's just going to spiral slowly down. First, one wing will come off, then the other, then the tail. And he said, when we did the autopsy later on Major Anderson's body, one tiny piece of shrapnel had pierced his pressure suit. So he probably died immediately, not from the crash, but from the lack of the proper air pressure, because normally he could eject. It's pretty unlikely that even if he ejected, he would have survived. He could have put out a mayday. He had a secret code for that, and he did neither. So I think it was that piercing of the pressure suit that killed Major Anderson. And that was the big surprise for me and the impetus to do the book. I didn't know that any of our military people died in combat during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, of course, Curtis LeMay, there he is, thinks that he's going to be able to go in and wipe out that surface-to-air missile site, and Kennedy goes, no, not yet. And LeMay's furious. There's steam coming out of his ears. When he leaves the room, he turns to one of his aides and he goes, I can't believe it, that Kennedy chickened out again. He told us what we should do, and now he's changing his mind again. But what the president wanted to do was he figured this is the last chance. We're on the step of nuclear war with all these events happening. He didn't even know about sub B-59. So he gets Bobby alone and he says to Bobby, go give the Soviet foreign minister our last offer. He never uses the word ultimatum, but that's what it is. And he says, we will promise not to invade Cuba, and at a later date, we'll take our missiles out of Turkey. That part has to be kept secret, just between Khrushchev and I. And you, Premier Khrushchev, have to remove all nuclear weapons out of Cuba. And so Sergei Khrushchev told me that when he got the cable of this offer and he learned about the shoot down of Major Rudy Anderson, he said, my father accepted it immediately because he could see this thing spiraling out of control as well. And he never intended it to turn into nuclear war either. Wait for the slow cabling system. He went on Radio Moscow and announced a deal had been reached so that we knew and we wouldn't launch the invasion. So LeMay was not happy. He never got to what he said was hit the Soviets when they're weakest, which was, in his mind, 1962. So Kennedy goes on the air and explains to the American people what happened. He doesn't talk about the deal about the nuclear weapons in Turkey. Again, that might have been for political reasons, so it doesn't look like he gave away too much. In reality, my take on it is we didn't give away much by pulling the missiles out of Turkey because we had Polaris submarines in the Mediterranean that could have launched nuclear weapons at Russia. Major Anderson's body was returned to the U.S. Here it is. You'll read in the book how tough it was for his wife. Just as a kind of a side story, a sad side story, a year before this happened, she got a knock on her door, and it was a military brass and a chaplain who said, "Your husband's been killed in a test flight." And they went to the wrong door. Major Anderson was fine. It was another pilot. Now she gets the knock on the door when he was shot down, and they say, "Your husband's been killed in a secret mission." And she doesn't know what to believe, and her whole world collapses. And you'll read kind of how harsh it is to be a military wife and be asked to leave the base right away. And she's got kids, she's pregnant at the time. It was really tough. Kennedy does something classy, though. After a couple of weeks, he decides, "I'm going to take the time out from my busy schedule, fly down to Florida, and thank these people that put their lives on the line, the Crusader pilots, the U-2 pilots, and some of the staff that organized those flights." And I remember Jerry goes, "Mike, so I'm all excited. I'm going to get to shake the president's hand." When at the last minute they tell me, "Jerry, you're low man on totem pole. You have to stay with the U-2 aircraft back in a hangar in case someone from the president's entourage wants to see it." So Jerry's like, "Darn, my one chance to see Kennedy." And then he goes, after Kennedy spoke, in comes the limousine into the hangar. And he said, Kennedy steps out of the limousine and he turns to his entourage and he says, "You all stay in the car. I want to have a private conversation with that young man up at the cockpit of the U-2. And so he climbs up the stairs, and that's how I close the book. What did these two combat veterans talk about at the cockpit of a U-2? And so if you're interested in Above and Beyond, I have them at a discount on my website, and there's a way that you can have me personalize the book if you want to give it for a Christmas gift to someone else. And also on that website is Jerry McElmoyle's interview about what it was like to see in his rearview mirror. And I said, "You really had a rearview mirror on an aircraft?" He goes, "Yeah, just like in your car." What it was like when he first saw that contrail coming up to take him down. And I dedicated the book to Jerry. Here he is. He was fantastic to work with. And to the 10 other U-2 pilots that put their lives on the line, and especially to Major Rudy Anderson, who it seems like history forgot. And I'm hoping the book kind of resurrects his legacy. He never got the, I think it's called the Medal of Honor, because the powers that be said it was a crisis, not a war, and you can't get it in a crisis, you can only get it in a war. But to me, it was combat. And now I'll stop the screen sharing, and if there's questions or comments, we can take them. 1 second. Okay, I'm back.
What was your
Yes,
What was your site address again?
it's Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, and then my last name is a tough spelling, Tougias and .com.
Okay.
So just my name.com. Yeah, Jerry was great to work with. You know, I'll just tell you this one story. He said later, I always wondered about my film. He said, so I was with President Reagan explaining about the nuclear, the briefcase. And he said the CIA was there, and the CIA said, "Thank you, General McElmoyle, if there's anything we can do to help you." And he goes, "Yes, there is. Find the guy who analyzed the film that I took of the contrail coming up at me." And he said a week later, he got a phone call, and it was the analyst. And he said, "Yeah, your film was destroyed, but oh yeah, we saw the starburst on it." So a lot of people didn't believe Jerry, but he said that was my proof when at the Reagan White House, I got that information that I always wondered about. Other questions or comments? I think if you had a question, you might have to unmute yourself or use the chat, either one.
Now, how old were you then?
Oh boy, I would have been 7 years old. And it's funny, I remember the assassination of the president like it happened yesterday, but I do not remember the Cuban Missile Crisis.